There are many ways to lose your freedom, but Valerie Ronalds was being stolen in broad daylight, wrapped in the respectable language of family duty and financial necessity. The carriage that carried her through London that October morning in 1818 was not a conveyance. It was a cage on wheels, bearing her to Thornbury Manor and a marriage that would seal her fate as permanently as a tomb. Her uncle had signed the papers. Her aunt had packed her trunk. Mr. Cornelius Thornbury awaited his young bride with the patience of a man who knew his purchase was guaranteed. No one had asked Valerie if she consented. No one had cared. But someone had been watching, and he was about to remind London that not every transaction could be completed without interference. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tales stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The autumn of 1818 would be remembered as the season Valerie Ronalds' life was sold from beneath her feet. At 22, Miss Valerie Ronald should have been preparing for her third London season, not sitting in the cramped study of her uncle's townhouse while he negotiated her future as though she were livestock at market. Her parents had died of fever when she was 19, leaving behind little more than affection and a modest trust that dissolved like morning mist when the solicitors finished their calculations. Her uncle, Mr. Edmund Ronald, had taken her in with the enthusiasm of a man accepting a particularly burdensome debt, which, she supposed, was exactly what she had become. She possessed what society called quiet appeal, dark honey hair that curled stubbornly at her temples, hazel eyes that revealed too much of what she was thinking, and a posture that her aunt insisted was too proud for a girl in your position. She had never been the beauty who stopped conversations when she entered a room. She had been content with that once, content to be overlooked if it meant being left in peace. But peace, she had learned, was a luxury reserved for those with fortunes to protect them. 3 days earlier, her uncle had summoned her to his study with the expression of a man who had solved a particularly vexing problem. "I've secured an arrangement," he had announced, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mr. Cornelius Thornbury of Thornbury Manor in Derbyshire. Widower, established estate. No heirs. He's willing to overlook your circumstances in exchange for a young wife." He had spoken as though presenting her with a gift rather than a life sentence. Mr. Thornbury was 53 years old. She had learned this from the marriage contract her aunt had thrust into her hands. The same contract that now sat folded in her reticule like a coiled snake. She had never met him, had never even seen his likeness. All she knew was that he owned land, required an heir, and had calculated that Valerie Ronald, orphaned and indebted, would cost him less than a wife with options. "You'll leave Thursday morning," her uncle had said, returning to his correspondence as though the matter were already forgotten. "The carriage is arranged. Your aunt has seen to your trousseau. You should be grateful, Valerie. Not every girl in your position finds such fortune." Fortune. The word tasted like ash. She had tried to speak, to protest, to ask for time, but her aunt had silenced her with a look sharp as cut glass. "You will do your duty to this family. Your parents' debts didn't disappear with them, child. This marriage clears the ledger. That is all that matters." That had been 3 days ago. Now, Valerie sat rigid in the burgundy travelling carriage, watching London scroll past the small window like a life she would never touch again. The morning was crisp and bright, the kind of October day that made the city look almost beautiful. Merchants called from shop fronts. Ladies strolled arm in arm, laughing at some private joke. A young couple paused at a corner, the gentleman helping his companion avoid a puddle with such tender care that Valerie felt something crack inside her chest. She would never have that. Would never be chosen, would never be anything more than a solution to someone else's problem. The carriage rattled over cobblestones with a rhythm that felt accusatory. Sold, sold, sold. Each jolt driving the reality deeper into her bones. Her gloved fingers gripped the edge of the seat until her knuckles ached. The morning sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny, indifferent witnesses to her exile. She had learned this feeling 2 years earlier, the night her life had first shattered in public view. It had been the Pemberton Ball, one of the grandest events of the 1816 season. She had worn her finest gown, pale silver silk that her mother had commissioned before the fever took her, and entered the ballroom on the arm of Mr. Philip Westbrook, the gentleman who had courted her for 3 months, with what she had foolishly believed was genuine affection. He had been handsome, charming, the second son of a baron with excellent prospects and a smile that made her believe she might matter to someone. He had brought her books of poetry, had engaged her in conversations about philosophy, had made her laugh when grief still sat heavy in her throat. "You have substance, Miss Ronald," he had told her one afternoon in her aunt's drawing-room, his expression earnest. "So many young ladies are concerned only with appearances and gossip. You think, you feel deeply. That is rare. That is valuable." She had allowed herself to hope, to imagine, to believe that someone saw worth in her beyond what she could bring to a marriage settlement. Then Miss Catherine Delacour had arrived in London, the only daughter of a shipping magnate with a dowry of $40,000, and her father's determination to buy her way into the aristocracy. Valerie had watched Philip's attention shift like a compass needle finding true north. Within 2 weeks, he was partnering Miss Delacour in every dance. Within a month, he was calling at the Delacour residence daily. And then, at the Pemberton Ball, beneath the chandelier that cast everything in merciless brightness, Philip had approached her near the terrace doors. "Miss Ronald," he had said, his voice carefully pitched to sound regretful, but loud enough that Lady Thornhill and her daughters could hear every word. "I hope you will understand that circumstances have evolved." She had known, had felt it in the pitying glances from other young ladies, in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, in the way her aunt had stopped mentioning Philip's name. "I hold you in great esteem," Philip had continued, his blue eyes sincere in the way that only the truly self-deceived could manage. "But I must be practical. My family has expectations. Miss Delacour's connections would benefit not only myself, but my entire family. Surely you, with your intelligence, understand that duty must guide us, not mere sentiment." He had smiled then, actually smiled, as though expecting her to agree, to absolve him, to make his betrayal comfortable. She had not cried, had not begged, had not given anyone the satisfaction of watching her crumble. She had lifted her chin, met his gaze steadily, and said in a voice that barely trembled, "I understand perfectly, Mr. Westbrook. I wish you every happiness you deserve." Then she had walked from that ballroom with her spine straight and her head high, even as shame and heartbreak threatened to drag her to her knees. What she had not known, what she could not have known, was that she had not been alone in that moment. In the shadows near the gallery stairs, a man had watched her leave. Nathan Dawson, Duke of Ashcombe, had been standing apart from the crush of dancers, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, observing the spectacle of society with his customary detachment. He attended such events out of obligation, not pleasure, finding most of the ton's entertainments tedious at best. But something had made him look toward the terrace doors at precisely the wrong, or perhaps right moment. He had witnessed the entire exchange, had seen Westbrook's calculated cruelty, had watched the young woman in silver silk absorb the blow without flinching, without giving anyone the weapon of her tears. He had seen her spine straighten instead of breaking, had seen her choose dignity over despair. And though he had not known her name that night, he had not forgotten her face. 2 years later, when whispers reached him through his network of solicitors and estate managers that the orphaned niece of Edmund Ronald was being shipped off to marry a stranger twice her age to clear family debts, Nathan Dawson had made inquiries. When he learned the woman's name was Valerie Ronald, something cold and decisive had settled in his chest. He remembered her. He remembered what she had endured. He remembered the strength it had taken to walk away from that ballroom, and he would not allow her to be traded like property. Now, as Valerie's carriage rolled through London's busy streets, carrying her toward a future she had not chosen, Nathan Dawson stood in the doorway of his study, pocket watch in hand, calculating timing and distance with the precision of a general planning a campaign. He had spent 2 years watching Valerie Ronald from the edges of ballrooms and social events, never approaching, never interfering. He had watched her rebuild herself after Westbrook's betrayal, had watched her care for her ailing parents with devotion that society took for granted, had watched her endure her relatives' coldness with grace that deserved better. In a world full of grasping, ambition, and practiced smiles, Valerie Ronald had been genuine, resilient, quietly extraordinary. And when he had learned that Edmund Ronald planned to sacrifice her to pay his gambling debts, Nathan had made a decision that would alter both their lives irrevocably. He snapped the watch closed, shrugged into his coat, and called for his horse. A carriage was predictable, its route mapped and timed. A man on horseback could intercept it, and Nathan Dawson had every intention of stopping that carriage before it carried Valerie Ronald beyond the reach of rescue. Inside the carriage, Valerie felt the vehicle slow as they approached a busier section of the street. Through the window, she could see crowds gathered near the market, vendors calling their wares, life continuing as though hers were not ending. She closed her eyes and allowed herself one moment, just one, to imagine a different life. One where she had choices, where someone had chosen her, not her circumstances. Then she opened her eyes and faced reality. The carriage was moving again, wheels turning steadily toward Derbyshire, toward Mr. Cornelius Thornbury, toward a life measured in duty rather than— "Stop the carriage!" The shout cracked through the morning air like a pistol shot. The horses screamed. The carriage lurched so violently that Valerie was thrown against the side panel, her shoulders striking wood as the driver hauled on the reins with desperate strength. The world tilted. Voices shouting, hooves clattering, the metallic scrape of wheels skidding over stone. Then silence, heavy and expectant. Valerie's breath came in sharp gasps as she pushed herself upright, one hand pressed to her bruised shoulder. Through the window she could see a crowd forming, faces turning, conversations stopping mid-sentence like a wave of attention rolling toward the carriage. The door was wrenched open. A man stood framed in morning sunlight, one gloved hand gripping the carriage door, the other resting on the frame with a casual authority that made the entire street seem to bend around him. His coat was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored across broad shoulders. His dark hair was immaculate, despite having clearly ridden hard to reach them. But it was his face that held her frozen, sharp-featured, aristocratic, and utterly unreadable except for his eyes, which burned with cold, focused intensity. "Miss Ronald," he said, his voice low and controlled but edged with something dangerous. "You will not continue this journey." Valerie's throat constricted. She knew that face. Everyone in London knew that face. Nathan Dawson, Duke of Ashcombe, the most powerful duke in England, unmarried, untouchable, a man who controlled fortunes with a word and whose displeasure could end political careers. He attended Parliament, managed vast estates, and moved through society like winter itself, beautiful, remote, and unforgiving. And he was staring directly at her as though she were the only person in London who mattered. "Your Grace?" The words came out barely above a whisper. "I don't understand." "Stand aside." Her uncle's voice shattered the moment. Edmund Ronald pushed through the gathering crowd, his face mottled red with fury and fear. "This is a private family matter, Your Grace. You have no right to interfere." Nathan didn't even glance at him. His gaze remained locked on Valerie, steady and certain, as though her uncle were nothing more than an irritating insect buzzing at the periphery of his awareness. "No right," Nathan repeated softly, finally turning his attention to Edmund. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You are sending your niece, an unmarried woman of good family and no independent means, to wed a stranger twice her age in a transaction arranged without her meaningful consent. That gives me every right to interfere." The crowd pressed closer. Valerie could hear the whispers spreading like fire through dry timber. The Duke of Ashcombe stopped her carriage. Why would he involve himself? Look at him. He's furious. Edmund sputtered, his practiced composure crumbling. "The marriage contract is signed. Mr. Thornbury's expectations," Nathan interrupted with lethal quiet, "are no longer relevant." He extended his hand toward Valerie. Palm up, the gesture somehow both an invitation and a command. "Step out of the carriage, Miss Ronald." Every instinct screamed confusion. Why was he here? How did he even know her name? They had never been introduced, had never exchanged so much as a word. She was nobody, a poor relation being discarded to settle debts. Dukes did not stop carriages in the street for women like her. Yet something in his eyes, that intensity sharpened by absolute certainty, told her this moment would not come twice. Her hand trembled as she reached for his. The instant her gloved fingers touched his palm, his hand closed around hers with firm, protective pressure. The contact sent a shock through her system, grounding and disorienting at once. He helped her down with deliberate care, positioning himself between her and the carriage as though it were an enemy he intended to guard her against. The crowd had grown to dozens now, forming a loose circle around the scene. Ladies whispered behind fans. Gentlemen watched with calculating interest. A street vendor had stopped calling his wares to stare. Nathan kept her hand in his thumb resting against her wrist where her pulse hammered visibly beneath the fabric. "This marriage will not proceed," he announced, his voice carrying across the street with absolute authority. Edmund's face purpled. "You cannot possibly—" "I can." Nathan's gaze cut to him like a blade. "And I am. Miss Ronald will not be sold to clear your gambling debts, Edmund. That ends now." Valerie's breath caught. Gambling debts. Her uncle had told her it was her parents' obligations, but of course it wasn't. Of course it was his own ruin he was trying to escape. "She has no choice," Edmund hissed, stepping closer. "No prospects, no dowry worth mention. She has a choice," Nathan said quietly, dangerously. "And that choice is no longer yours to make." Then he turned to Valerie, and for one suspended moment, the crowd, the scandal, the entire city seemed to fall away. "Miss Ronald," he said, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like recognition, as though he had known her far longer than the past 5 minutes suggested. "I am offering you an alternative." Her heart stuttered. "An alternative. I will marry you." The words fell like thunder. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a package. A woman's fan clattered to the cobblestones. Valerie stared at him, certain she had misheard, certain the morning's stress had fractured her understanding of reality. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice shaking, "you cannot possibly—" "It will be a practical arrangement," he continued, speaking for her ears alone, though his hand still held hers in front of all of London. "You will be protected. Your family's legitimate debts will be resolved, and no one will ever move you like cargo again." "But you don't know me," she whispered. "You don't— Why would you—" Something shifted in his expression, just for an instant. Something that looked almost like pain. "Because 2 years ago," he said softly, "I watched you walk out of a ballroom with your dignity intact when you had every reason to break. And I have never forgotten it." The world tilted. He had been there. At the Pemberton ball, he had witnessed her humiliation, her heartbreak, her desperate attempt to salvage pride from devastation. He had seen her. "Your Grace," Edmund began desperately. "The discussion is over," Nathan said without looking at him. His eyes remained on Valerie, searching, waiting. "Miss Ronald," Will you accept my offer? She should refuse, should demand explanations, time, understanding. This was madness. A duke proposing marriage in the middle of the street to a woman he had never formally met. But as she looked up at Nathan Dawson, at the controlled intensity in his dark eyes, at the way he stood between her and everything that had been trying to consume her, Valerie realized something fundamental. She could climb back into that carriage and disappear into the prison her uncle had built for her, or she could step into the unknown with a man who had stopped the world to give her a choice. "Yes," she whispered. Nathan's hand tightened on hers. "Then it is done." The crowd erupted, and Valerie Ronald understood with perfect, terrifying clarity that her life had just violently veered off every course she had ever imagined. 2 years earlier, the Pemberton Ball, May 1816, Valerie had believed in love that night. At 20 years old, wearing her mother's silver silk gown with her hair arranged in careful curls, she had entered the Pemberton ballroom on Mr. Philip Westbrook's arm and allowed herself to believe that happiness might be possible even after grief. Her parents had been dead only 8 months, but Philip had coaxed her back toward life with patience and what she had foolishly mistaken for genuine affection. He was handsome in the way that made other young ladies sigh. Golden hair, blue eyes, the easy charm of a second son with good prospects and no immediate pressure to marry for advantage. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met," he had told her in her aunt's drawing room just a week earlier, his expression earnest. "You think deeply. You feel truly. In a world of practiced smiles and calculated flirtations, you are real, Miss Ronald. That is precious beyond measure." She had let herself hope, let herself imagine a future where she mattered to someone, where she could build a home and family to replace what death had stolen. Then Miss Catherine Delacour had arrived in London with £40,000 and her merchant father's ruthless determination to buy aristocratic connections. Valerie had watched Philip's attention shift like a compass needle finding north. The afternoon drives stopped. The poetry volumes ceased appearing. His visits to her aunt's house grew brief, distracted, apologetic. She had known what was coming, had felt it in the pitying glances from other debutantes, in the way Lady Thornhill's daughters whispered behind their fans whenever she entered a room, in the careful way her aunt stopped mentioning Philip's name. But nothing had prepared her for the moment he approached her near the terrace doors, beneath the massive chandelier that cast everything in merciless, glittering light. "Miss Ronald?" His voice was carefully modulated, regretful but not quite apologetic, loud enough that Lady Thornhill and her circle could hear every word. "I hope you will understand that my circumstances have evolved." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Around them, conversation continued, but she could feel attention shifting, people angling closer to witness the spectacle. "I hold you in sincere esteem," Philip continued, his blue eyes earnest in the way only the self-deceived could manage. "But I must be practical. Miss Delacour's fortune would benefit not only myself, but my entire family. My father's estate requires modernization. My sister needs a proper dowry. Surely you, with your intelligence, understand that duty must guide us rather than mere sentiment." Mere sentiment. As though the months of courtship, the promises implied if not spoken, the hope he had deliberately cultivated, as though all of it had been nothing more than a pleasant diversion until something better presented itself. He smiled then, actually smiled, as though expecting her to absolve him, to make his betrayal comfortable. The humiliation was exquisite. She could feel it radiating through her body like poison could. See it reflected in the satisfied expressions of the women who had always resented her brief moment of romantic success. Miss Catherine Delacour stood across the ballroom in rose silk, watching with cool calculation, already certain of her victory. Valerie's hands trembled. Tears burned behind her eyes, threatening to spill and give everyone exactly what they wanted, the spectacle of her complete destruction. But something in her, some stubborn core of pride her mother had instilled, refused to break in front of them. She lifted her chin, met Philip's gaze with steady composure that cost her everything, and said in a voice that barely trembled, "I understand perfectly, Mr. Westbrook. I wish you every happiness that you deserve." The emphasis on the final word was so slight that Philip missed it entirely. But Lady Thornhill's eldest daughter caught it, and her expression shifted from satisfaction to something almost like respect. Valerie turned away from him, from the whispers, from the pitying glances and satisfied smirks. She walked across that ballroom with her spine straight and her head high, even as shame and heartbreak clawed at her composure with savage intensity. She made it to the entrance hall, made it past the footmen and through the doors, made it to the stone steps outside where the night air hit her face like a benediction. Only then did she allow the first tears to fall. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that she had not been alone in her moment of devastation. Near the gallery stairs, partially obscured by shadow and architectural columns, Nathan Dawson, Duke of Ashcombe, stood with an untouched glass of champagne in his hand. He had attended the Pemberton ball out of social obligation, finding most such entertainments tedious exercises in observation rather than participation. He came, was seen, and left. Nothing more. But something had drawn his attention toward the terrace doors at precisely the moment Philip Westbrook had delivered his calculated cruelty. Nathan had watched the entire scene unfold, had seen the young woman in silver silk absorb the blow without flinching, without giving anyone the satisfaction of her tears, had witnessed her spine straighten when it should have broken, had seen her choose dignity over despair. In a ballroom full of practiced emotions and calculated displays, her genuine strength had been remarkable, extraordinary. He had not known her name that night, had not approached or interfered. Such matters were not his concern, but he had not forgotten her face. Present day, standing in the London street with Valerie's hand still clasped in his, Nathan remembered everything. He remembered the silver dress, the way she had lifted her chin, the carefully controlled tremor in her voice as she wished Westbrook the happiness he deserved. He had watched her rebuild herself over the following 2 years, always from a distance, never interfering. Had seen her at subsequent social events, quieter now, more careful, but still possessing that core of resilient grace. When whispers reached him that Edmund Ronald planned to trade her to clear gambling debts, Nathan had made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not allow her to be sacrificed again. Not while he remembered what it had cost her to walk out of that ballroom with her dignity intact. "Your Grace." Valerie's voice pulled him back to the present, her hazel eyes searching his face with confusion and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Why did you? "Because," Nathan said quietly, "you deserved better then, and you deserve better now." Around them, London watched and whispered, but for one moment there were only 2 people in the world who understood what it meant to be truly seen. The Duke of Ashcombe's London residence was everything Valerie had imagined, and nothing she had expected. The drawing room where Nathan had brought her was elegant without being ostentatious. Deep blue walls, mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a private garden. Tasteful, controlled, much like the man himself. Her aunt and uncle had been left behind in the street, sputtering protests that Nathan had silenced with a single look and instructions to his solicitor. Now, sitting across from him with afternoon light slanting through the windows, Valerie felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her like a physical thing. A duke had stopped her carriage, had proposed marriage in front of half of London, had brought her to his home as though it were already decided. Nathan sat in the chair opposite, his posture relaxed but somehow still commanding. He had removed his gloves, and Valerie found herself staring at his hands, elegant, capable, utterly calm. "I believe we should establish the terms clearly," he said. his voice even and businesslike, as though negotiating a property transaction rather than a marriage. "This will be a practical arrangement, Miss Ronald. Nothing more." The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they landed with unexpected weight. "I will not force affection where none exists," Nathan continued, his dark eyes steady on hers. "You will have your own chambers, your own household authority, complete autonomy in how you spend your time. I ask only for the appearance of a functional marriage in public settings. In private, we need be nothing more than civil strangers sharing a name and residence." Valerie's throat tightened. "Then why marry me at all?" Something flickered in his expression, too quick to interpret. "Because the alternative was unacceptable." To whom? To me. The simplicity of the answer was somehow more devastating than elaborate explanation would have been. He had intervened because he had chosen to, not out of love or even particular fondness, but because his sense of justice had been offended by her circumstances. She was a problem he had decided to solve. Nothing more. "Your family's legitimate debts will be settled," Nathan continued. "Your uncle's gambling obligations are his own concern and will not be paid. You will have a generous allowance, access to the Ashcombe estates, and my protection from anyone who might seek to use or manipulate you." "And you?" Valerie asked quietly. "What do you gain from this arrangement?" Nathan was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving to the window, to the garden beyond. "A duchess capable of managing my household. Someone who will not expect things I cannot give. Someone who understands that marriage need not be a romantic entanglement to be functional. Someone who has already been broken by love and won't demand it from me." He didn't say it, but Valerie heard it anyway. She should refuse, should demand time, explanations, courtship, all the things a proper engagement required. But as she sat in that elegant drawing room, weighing her options with brutal clarity, Valerie understood the choice before her. Return to her uncle's house and be shipped to Derbyshire to marry a stranger who wanted only an heir and had purchased her like livestock. Or marry a different stranger, one who offered protection, independence, and honesty about his lack of feeling. One prison or another. At least this one came with dignity. "I accept your terms, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the fear curling through her chest. Nathan's expression remained unreadable. "Nathan, if we are to be married, you should use my given name." Nathan. The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that contradicted everything about their arrangement. He stood, extending his hand as he had in the street. "Then it is settled. I will procure a special license. We can be married within the week." "A week?" Valerie's composure fractured slightly. "That's necessary. The scandal is already spreading. A swift marriage will contain it." His tone gentled almost imperceptibly. "Unless you need more time." She thought of her uncle's fury, of Mr. Thornbury waiting in Derbyshire, of Philip Westbrook's betrayal still sharp in her memory. "No," she whispered. "A week is sufficient." Society erupted. The whispers became roars, became printed speculation in scandal sheets. The Duke of Ashcombe, who had never shown interest in any woman, had stopped a carriage in broad daylight and claimed its occupant as his bride. Some called it romance, others called it madness. Everyone watched. Lady Thornhill declared it unseemly haste. Miss Catherine Delacour, now Mrs. Philip Westbrook, told anyone who would listen that poor Miss Ronald has always been rather desperate. The betting books at White's filled with wagers about how long the marriage would last. Nathan ignored it all with aristocratic indifference. Valerie endured it with the same dignity she had learned in that ballroom 2 years earlier. Their wedding took place on a grey morning in the private chapel at Ashcombe House. No guests beyond the legal witnesses, no celebration, no pretense of joy. Valerie wore a simple ivory gown, her hands steady as she signed the register. Nathan stood beside her in dark grey, his expression calm and distant, as though observing the ceremony from a great height rather than participating in it. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan's kiss was brief and perfunctory, a brushing of lips that conveyed nothing but duty fulfilled. As they left the chapel, now bound together by law and circumstance, Valerie glanced at her new husband's profile, austere, controlled, unknowable. She had married a stranger to escape being married to a stranger, and she had absolutely no idea whether she had saved herself or simply chosen a more elegant cage. Ashcombe Estate was beautiful in the way that glaciers were beautiful. Vast, breathtaking, and utterly cold. The manor itself sprawled across the Derbyshire countryside like a monument to old wealth and older bloodlines. Stone corridors stretched in elegant symmetry. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. Gardens bloomed in mathematical precision beyond the windows. It should have felt like a prison. Instead, after 3 weeks of marriage, Valerie found herself breathing more easily than she had in years. Nathan kept his promises with the same precision he applied to everything else. She had her own suite of rooms in the East Wing, bedroom, sitting room, and private study, all decorated in soft greens and creams that someone had clearly chosen with care. Her mornings were her own, her afternoons uninterrupted. The household staff answered to her with deference that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Nathan made no demands. He joined her for dinner each evening, conversation polite and impersonal. Estate matters, books they had read, observations about the weather. He never touched her beyond the occasional formal gesture in public, never entered her rooms uninvited, never questioned how she spent her time. It was exactly what he had promised: respectful, autonomous, emotionally distant. Yet Valerie found herself watching him. He rose before dawn. She had learned from the servants. Rode his stallion across the estate for an hour, reviewing tenant concerns and boundary maintenance with methodical attention. He spent mornings in his study, managing investments and correspondence with an efficiency that made most men look careless by comparison. Afternoons were devoted to Parliament business when in London or estate improvements when in residence. He was disciplined to the point of severity, controlled to the point of isolation. She never saw him laugh, never saw him relax. He moved through the world like a man who had learned long ago that emotion was a liability he could not afford. Yet small things began to accumulate. Books appeared on her sitting-room table. Volumes of poetry she had mentioned admiring in passing during dinner. A new riding habit materialized in her wardrobe after she had casually mentioned missing her morning rides. When a letter arrived from a distant cousin making veiled comments about her sudden elevation, Nathan's response, which he left on the hall table for her to read before sending, was viciously polite in its defense of her character and his choice. He never mentioned these gestures, never sought credit or acknowledgement. But Valerie noticed. She noticed the way he listened when she spoke, truly listened, his attention focused with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way Philip's charm never had. She noticed that he never corrected her in front of the servants, even when she made mistakes about household protocol. She noticed that he asked her opinion about estate decisions, then actually implemented her suggestions without condescension. Most unsettling of all, she noticed the way he watched her. It happened in unguarded moments. When she was reading in the library and glanced up to find his gaze on her face, something unreadable in his expression before he looked away. When she laughed at something the housekeeper said and caught him pausing in the doorway, his features softening almost imperceptibly. When she played the pianoforte in the music room one evening, unaware he had entered until she finished, and found him standing by the window, utterly still. "I didn't know you played," he had said quietly. "My mother taught me." The memory still hurt, but less sharply than before. "I haven't practiced in years. You should continue. The instrument deserves to be used." He had left without another word, but the next morning a stack of sheet music appeared on the piano, pieces she had mentioned loving as a child. He watched. He remembered. He acted on what he observed, and he never, ever mentioned any of it. One evening, nearly a month into their marriage, Valerie stood at her bedroom window watching storm clouds gather over the distant hills. Thunder rumbled, low and threatening. She had always loved storms, the drama, the release, the way they made the world feel alive. A knock at her door startled her. Nathan stood in the corridor, still dressed for dinner, his expression carefully neutral. "The storm will be severe. I wanted to ensure you had everything you needed. The staff mentioned you sometimes find thunder unsettling." Valerie blinked. She had mentioned that once, weeks ago, in passing to the housekeeper, an offhand comment about childhood fears. He had remembered. "I'm fine, thank you." Her voice came out softer than intended. "Actually, I've always rather liked storms." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "As do I." They stood there, separated by the doorway, as lightning flickered in the distance. The air felt charged, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weather. "Good night, Valerie," Nathan said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Good night." He turned away, footsteps echoing down the corridor. Valerie closed the door and pressed her back against it, her heart beating too fast. For 3 weeks, she had told herself this was a business arrangement, a marriage of convenience between two people who wanted nothing from each other beyond civility and mutual advantage. But as thunder rolled across the Derbyshire hills and rain began to fall, Valerie realized something that terrified her. She felt safe here, safe with him, and safety, she had learned, was the most dangerous thing to trust. Because the last time she had felt safe with a man, he had abandoned her beneath a chandelier in front of all of London. Nathan Dawson was keeping his promises, was treating her with care and respect, was giving her everything he had offered. But Valerie had learned that promises could be broken, that care could be withdrawn, that today's protection could become tomorrow's indifference. She had survived heartbreak once by never expecting it to heal. The thought that she might be foolish enough to hope again, to believe that this cold, controlled duke might actually care, that was the most frightening thing of all. The Marchioness of Pemberton's autumn ball was the first major social event since Valerie's marriage, and all of London had come to watch the spectacle. She descended the grand staircase on Nathan's arm, acutely aware of every eye tracking their movement. Her gown was midnight blue silk, elegant and expensive, chosen by Nathan's modiste without her input, but fitting perfectly nonetheless. Diamonds glittered at her throat, the Ashcombe jewels heavy with history and expectation. Nathan was impeccable beside her in black evening clothes, his expression revealing nothing. His hand rested formally at her elbow, the touch light and impersonal, exactly as it had been for the past 6 weeks of their marriage. The whispers started immediately. Married within a week. Quite scandalous. Hardly knows the man. Desperate circumstances. How long before he tires of his charity project? Valerie lifted her chin and smiled with practiced serenity, the same mask she had worn through countless humiliations. Nathan's presence beside her was steady, anchoring, but she had learned not to mistake protection for actual caring. The evening proceeded in careful choreography, polite greetings, shallow conversations, the constant assessment of society's most ruthless judges. Nathan never left her side, his manner attentive but remote, the perfect illustration of a duke fulfilling marital duty without particular enthusiasm. Then Philip Westbrook appeared. He approached during a lull in the dancing, his wife Catherine on his arm, both dressed in ostentatious finery that spoke of new money, trying desperately to look like old. Philip's smile was practiced charm, his eyes calculating as they swept over Valerie's diamonds. "Your Grace," He addressed Nathan with a bow that was just slightly too shallow to be properly respectful. "And Lady Ashcombe, what a remarkable transformation. One can hardly reconcile the girl I knew with the Duchess before me." Valerie's stomach clenched. Beside her, Nathan had gone utterly still. "Indeed," Catherine added, her voice honey-sweet and venomous. "We were just saying how fortunate you were, dear Valerie, to be rescued from such unfortunate circumstances. Not every girl in your position finds a duke willing to overlook, well, everything really." The nearby conversations had ceased. People were listening now, watching, waiting to see if the Duke of Ashcombe's unexpected bride would crumble under scrutiny. Philip's smile widened. One must admire His Grace's charitable nature. Taking in a woman with no prospects, no fortune, nothing to recommend her beyond— He paused delicately. "Well, one hesitates to speculate on what motivated such generosity." The implication was clear. Devastating. Philip was suggesting that Nathan had married her out of pity, or worse, that she had somehow manipulated or seduced her way into the title. Valerie felt her face flush, humiliation burning through her chest. Her hands trembled. This was the Pemberton ball again, the same destroying mockery, the same public shame. Nathan's hand moved to the small of her back. The touch was possessive, unmistakable, burning through the silk of her gown like a brand. "Mr. Westbrook." Nathan's voice was soft, controlled, and absolutely lethal. "You will choose your next words with exceptional care." The temperature seemed to drop. Around them, people stepped back instinctively, recognizing danger. Philip's smile faltered. "Your Grace, I meant no offense." "You meant every offense," Nathan interrupted, his tone conversational but edged with steel. "And you have made 3 critical errors in judgment." He took a half-step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Valerie, his hand still burning against her back. "First, you have presumed to speak of my wife's circumstances as though you have any right to discuss her." "You do not." Philip's face paled. "Second, you have implied that my choice to marry Lady Ashcombe was motivated by charity or manipulation. Let me be extraordinarily clear. I married my wife because I chose her. Not from pity, not from obligation, because in a ballroom full of calculating smiles and practiced performances, she was the only person worth noticing." Valerie's breath caught. Around them, fans had frozen mid-flutter. "And third," Nathan continued, his voice dropping to something dangerous and final, "you have insulted the Duchess of Ashcombe in my presence. That is a miscalculation you will not make twice." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his gaze holding Philip's with predatory intensity. "You will apologize to my wife. You will do so now, with sincerity and clarity, and then you will remove yourself from her presence and take great care never to speak of her again. Am I understood?" It wasn't a question. It was a command, delivered with the weight of ducal authority and personal fury, barely contained beneath aristocratic control. Philip looked as though he might argue, but something in Nathan's expression, cold, absolute, and utterly unforgiving, made him think better of it. "Lady Ashcombe." His voice was strained, humiliated. "I apologize for my thoughtless comments. Please forgive my discourtesy." Nathan's expression didn't change. "Leave." Philip and Catherine fled, their exit watched by every person in the ballroom. The silence that followed was profound. Then Lady Pemberton herself appeared, her expression warm with approval. "Your Grace, Lady Ashcombe, would you honor me with your presence in the next dance?" The spell broke. Conversation resumed. But everything had changed. Nathan guided Valerie toward the dance floor, his hand still resting possessively at her back. As they took position for the waltz, his dark eyes finally met hers, and what she saw there stole her breath. Fury, yes, but beneath it, something fierce and protective and undeniably personal. Nathan, she whispered as the music began. You didn't have to. Yes, he said quietly, his hand closing around hers with unmistakable possessiveness. I did. They moved through the waltz in silence, but Valerie felt something fundamental shift between them. He wasn't just protecting her reputation or fulfilling marital duty. He had chosen her, publicly, decisively, with a passion that shattered every careful boundary he had constructed. As the dance ended and Nathan led her from the floor, Valerie realized with terrifying clarity the cold Duke had shown his hand, and she had no idea what to do with the truth burning in his eyes. They returned to Ashcombe House in silence, the carriage wheels turning steadily through London's dark streets. Nathan sat across from her rather than beside her, his expression unreadable in the dim light, but Valerie could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. He had defended her, had claimed her publicly with a fierceness that contradicted everything about their careful arrangement, and she had no idea what it meant. The house was quiet when they arrived, servants already retired for the evening. Nathan helped her from the carriage with formal courtesy, but his hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, his thumb brushing across her gloved knuckles before he released her. "Good night, Valerie," he said, his voice rougher than usual. She should agree, should retreat to her rooms and pretend that tonight had been nothing more than a duke protecting his reputation through his wife. But something in her refused to let this moment pass without understanding. "Nathan." She caught his sleeve as he turned toward his study. "Please, I need to know why." He went still, his back to her, every line of his body taut with restraint. "Why you defended me," Valerie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why you married me in the first place. You said it was practical, but tonight—" Her voice broke slightly. "Tonight didn't feel practical." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. "Come with me." He led her not to the formal drawing room, but to his private study, a room she had never entered. It was smaller than she expected, lined with books and papers, a fire burning low in the grate. Personal. Intimate. Nathan poured 2 glasses of brandy with hands that weren't quite steady, offering her one before taking position by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "I told you I was at the Pemberton ball 2 years ago," he said finally. "That I saw what Westbrook did to you." "Yes." "What I didn't tell you." He paused, jaw tightening. "What I couldn't tell you is that I have thought of that moment every day since." Valerie's breath caught. Nathan turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes was raw, vulnerable, nothing like the controlled duke she had married. "You walked out of that ballroom with your dignity intact when you had every reason to shatter. You chose strength over tears, grace over bitterness. And his voice roughened. "I couldn't stop watching you, at subsequent balls, assemblies, every social event where you appeared. I watched you rebuild yourself, watched you endure pity and cruelty with quiet resilience, watched you refuse to diminish yourself to make others comfortable." "You were watching me?" The words came out stunned. "For 2 years?" "Yes." The admission seemed to cost him. I told myself it was idle observation, that I simply appreciated strength of character. But when I learned your uncle planned to sell you to Thornbury, his hands clenched. I couldn't allow it, couldn't let you be traded away like property after everything you had already endured. So you stopped the carriage out of what? Admiration. Valerie's voice shook. "Nathan, you married me. You bound yourself to a woman you didn't know because I couldn't bear the alternative," he cut in, his control finally fracturing. "Because watching you suffer again would have been unbearable. Because in a world full of calculation and performance, you were real, Valerie. Genuine and strong, and worth more than any of them could see." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with intensity barely contained. "I told myself I could keep it practical, could give you protection without attachment. But tonight, when Westbrook dared to mock you, when he implied you were anything less than extraordinary. His voice dropped to something raw and desperate. I wanted to destroy him, not as a duke protecting his reputation, but as a man who— He stopped, jaw clenched, as though the words themselves were too dangerous to release. A man who what? Valerie whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nathan closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hand rising to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted the fierce emotion in his eyes. A man who has been falling in love with his wife since the moment she took his hand in that London street and chose courage over fear. The world tilted. You— Valerie couldn't breathe. You love me. Desperately. The word was confession and surrender. I have tried to maintain distance, to honor our agreement, to give you the freedom I promised, but Valerie, you have undone me completely. The way you move through my home as though it were yours, the way you speak to the servants with genuine kindness, the way you play piano when you think no one is listening. Every small thing you do makes it harder to pretend this is merely practical. Tears burned in Valerie's eyes. I thought you kept your distance because you didn't want me, because I was duty and obligation and nothing more. Not wanting you. Nathan's laugh was bitter, anguished. Valerie, I have wanted you with an intensity that terrifies me. But I promised you autonomy. Promised no demands. How could I confess feelings you never asked for and might not want? Never asked for, Valerie repeated, her voice breaking. Nathan, I have been falling in love with you since you left poetry on my table and defended me in letters you thought I wouldn't see. Since you remembered I loved storms and never corrected me in front of servants. Since you looked at me as though I mattered beyond my usefulness. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching a tear. You matter more than anything. Then stop keeping your distance, she whispered. Stop treating me like a contract. I don't want practical anymore, Nathan. I want you. The last of his control shattered. He kissed her with desperate intensity, one hand cradling her face, the other pulling her against him as though afraid she might disappear. It was nothing like the perfunctory kiss at their wedding. This was passion and possession, and 2 years of restrained longing finally unleashed. Valerie kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his coat, her body molding to his as years of loneliness and fear dissolved beneath the heat of being truly wanted. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. Come upstairs with me, he said quietly. Not as obligation, as choice. Valerie smiled through tears. Yes. He led her to his chambers, and that night their marriage transformed from contract to covenant. In the darkness, with Nathan's arms around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Valerie finally understood what it meant to be chosen. Not rescued, not pitied, loved. Spring came to Ashcombe with a warmth that felt like benediction. The estate transformed under Valerie's influence in ways that surprised even the long-time servants. Gardens that had been maintained with rigid formality now bloomed with wildflowers she had planted alongside the roses. The library, once austere and untouched, became a gathering place where she hosted literary discussions for the local gentry. Tenant families who had previously dealt only with Nathan's steward now found the Duchess visiting their homes, remembering their children's names, genuinely listening to their concerns. Nathan watched her flourish with an expression that no longer resembled ducal indifference. He had stopped pretending months ago. Now he reached for her hand during morning walks, kissed her temple when he thought no one was watching, stood close enough in public that his possession was unmistakable. The cold Duke had melted so completely that Lady Pemberton told anyone who would listen that Ashcombe is utterly besotted with his Duchess. It's quite scandalous how much he adores her. Nathan didn't deny it. Let them talk, he had murmured one evening, pulling Valerie into his arms in the library without regard for the open door. I spent 2 years hiding what I felt. I'm done pretending you're anything less than the center of my world." Society had adjusted accordingly. Invitations flooded Ashcombe House, not from pity or scandal-seeking, but genuine respect. The Duchess of Ashcombe had become someone worth knowing, and her husband's fierce devotion only elevated her status. Meanwhile, others fell from grace. Edmund Ronald's gambling debts had caught up with him spectacularly. Without Valerie's marriage to Thornbury to clear his obligations, creditors had closed in like wolves. He had been forced to sell the London townhouse and retreat to a modest property in the north. His social standing evaporated, his plans for recovery non-existent. Nathan had ensured that none of his former connections would extend credit or assistance. "Karma," Valerie had said mildly when she learned, feeling nothing but distant satisfaction. Philip Westbrook's situation was more subtle but equally devastating. His marriage to Catherine had proven as mercenary as everyone predicted. Her father's fortune came with controlling strings, and Philip found himself little more than a decorative accessory in his father-in-law's business dealings. At recent social events, he had been pale, diminished, watching Valerie with something that looked painfully like regret. Nathan had noticed, had positioned himself between Philip and Valerie with casual possessiveness that communicated everything without words. "She is mine. You had your chance. You will never touch her again." Valerie had found she didn't need Nathan's protection from Philip anymore. The man who had once broken her heart now seemed small, pathetic, unworthy of even her anger. She had moved so far beyond him that he barely registered as memory. One morning in late April, Valerie woke to overwhelming nausea and sudden certainty. She was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She had wanted this, wanted Nathan's child, wanted to build the family she had lost, but the vulnerability of it frightened her, the way caring for someone so completely made everything feel fragile. Nathan found her in the garden that afternoon, sitting on the stone bench beneath the cherry blossoms, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach. "Valerie?" He was beside her instantly, concern sharpening his features. "What's wrong? Are you ill?" "No." She looked up at him, tears blurring her vision. "Nathan, we're going to have a baby." He went utterly still. For one terrifying moment, she couldn't read his expression. Then his face transformed, shock giving way to wonder, giving way to pure, incandescent joy, so complete it shattered every remnant of his former stoicism. "A baby," he repeated, his voice breaking. He dropped to his knees before her, his hands covering hers on her stomach. His eyes, bright with unshed tears. "Valerie, are you happy?" she whispered, needing to hear it. "Happy?" Nathan laughed, the sound ragged with emotion. "I didn't know joy like this existed. I didn't know I could feel this much." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of spun glass and infinite strength simultaneously. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet, his expression vulnerable in ways she had never imagined the controlled Duke of Ashcombe could be. "You have given me everything," he said quietly. "A home that feels alive, a marriage that matters, and now—" His hand pressed gently against her stomach. "Now this. Valerie, I don't deserve you, but I will spend every day of my life being worthy of what you've given me." She cupped his face. This man who had stopped a carriage and changed her world. "You already are." That evening, Nathan dismissed the servants early and made love to her with reverent tenderness, his hands worshipping her body as though it held something sacred. Afterward, with her head on his chest and his arms wrapped protectively around her, Valerie felt something settle deep in her soul. She was loved, not conditionally, not practically, not as duty or obligation or charitable rescue. Deeply, completely, irrevocably loved by a man who had seen her at her lowest and chosen her anyway. The girl who had been traded like cargo, who had walked out of a ballroom with her heart shattered, who had sat in a carriage believing her life was ending. That girl was gone. In her place was the Duchess of Ashcombe, beloved wife, soon-to-be mother, woman who had been seen and chosen and cherished. And as Nathan's heartbeat thrummed steady beneath her ear, Valerie finally understood what freedom felt like. It felt like being loved by someone who would never let her fall. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter drifted through Ashcombe's open windows, carried on the warm June breeze like music. Valerie stood in the drawing-room doorway, watching her daughter Eleanor chase her younger brother James across the lawn, while their father pretended to be a fearsome dragon in pursuit. Nathan's coat had been abandoned on a garden bench. His cravat hung loose. His dark hair was disheveled from small hands, tugging at it with gleeful abandon. He looked nothing like the cold, controlled Duke who had stopped a carriage 5 years earlier. He looked happy. "Mama!" Eleanor shrieked, spotting her and changing course with 4-year-old determination. "Papa is being the dragon again, and he's very fierce." "Terrifying," Valerie agreed solemnly as her daughter barreled into her skirts. Nathan scooped up James, barely 2 and wobbling on uncertain legs, and carried him over with exaggerated stomping that made the boy giggle uncontrollably. "The dragon has been defeated by superior forces," Nathan announced, pressing a kiss to Valerie's temple while James reached for her with chubby arms. "I surrender unconditionally." Eleanor cheered. James babbled something that might have been victory, or simply more gibberish, and Valerie felt her heart expand with a contentment so complete it still sometimes surprised her. This life, this loud, chaotic, joy-filled life, had seemed impossible that October morning when she had sat in a carriage believing her future was being stolen. Society had long since stopped speculating about the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe. The scandal had transformed into romance, then settled into reverence. Valerie was now considered one of the most influential duchesses in England. Her salons were sought after, her opinions valued, her charitable works celebrated. Invitations to Ashcombe were prizes to be coveted. Lady Pemberton had remarked just last season, "I always knew Ashcombe would choose someone extraordinary. He simply waited until he found her." Philip Westbrook no longer attended major social events. His marriage had collapsed 2 years earlier in spectacular fashion, leaving him diminished and alone. Valerie had heard through gossip networks and felt nothing but distant pity. Her uncle Edmund had died the previous winter, unmourned and unremarked upon. She had not attended his funeral. Some chapters, she had learned, deserved to be closed without ceremony. "What are you thinking?" Nathan asked quietly, settling James on his hip while Eleanor ran off to investigate a butterfly. Valerie looked up at her husband, this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had chosen her when she had nothing to offer, who had loved her into becoming someone she had never imagined she could be. "I was thinking about the carriage," she said softly. Nathan's expression shifted, understanding immediately. He reached for her hand, threading their fingers together with the casual intimacy of years. "The day everything changed," he murmured. "No." Valerie shook her head, squeezing his hand. "The day everything began." She thought about the girl she had been, orphaned, powerless, being transported toward a future she hadn't chosen. She thought about the sound those carriage wheels had made, rattling over cobblestones like a sentence being carried out. She thought about the moment those wheels had stopped, not because she had been rescued, because she had been recognized. Nathan had not saved her from drowning. He had seen her treading water and offered his hand. Not out of pity, but because he understood what it cost to keep your head above the surface when the world wanted you to sink. "I love you," she said, the words inadequate for the depth of feeling behind them. Nathan's smile was soft, genuine, the expression of a man who had learned that allowing himself to feel didn't make him weak. It made him human. "I loved you the moment you took my hand in that London street," he replied. "I will love you until my last breath. And if there is anything beyond that, I will love you there too." James squirmed, demanding attention. Eleanor returned with a crushed flower as an offering. The afternoon stretched ahead with all its ordinary chaos and extraordinary joy, and as Valerie watched her family, her husband, her children, the life they had built together, she understood the truth with perfect clarity. The carriage had never really stopped. It had simply changed direction, from a future chosen by fear and obligation toward one built on recognition, respect, and a love so fierce it had rewritten the rules of what was possible. Years later, when people told the story of how the Duke of Ashcombe had stopped a carriage in the middle of London to claim his bride, they called it romantic. They called it scandalous. They called it the social event of the decade. But Valerie knew what it really was. It was the moment she stopped being moved by others' hands and began choosing her own path. It was the moment Nathan Dawson looked at her and saw not what she lacked, but everything she was. It was not rescue, it was recognition, and that made all the difference. The day the Duke stopped, the carriage was not the day Valerie Ronald was saved. It was the day her life was returned to her, and the day Nathan Dawson found the only woman who could stop him. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.